Well, I was joking with some of the guys as we came in because we're doing Exodus right now, and the next book of the Bible is Leviticus, and I know that everyone will just be clamoring for a lot of study of Leviticus. If I had a nickel, I said to them, for every time I've been asked to do Leviticus, I'd have one whole nickel because just doesn't come up a whole lot. It's a pretty tough section of scripture there, and when you see things like the tabernacle layout on a handout, some of you I know you immediately worried that you might have had late stage narcolepsy that had approached, that you were going to just fall asleep right where you were. It really is hard to think of something more interesting than reading words like the aditum and the altar for burnt offering. Ooh, tell us more about that. That's, there are certain things in life that you really relish and you look forward to. There are other things that perhaps you don't. When my kids were little, I remember one particular moment where my son Samuel wanted to play Candyland. I don't know why, but I have never liked the game Candyland. I think there are just certain things that from your own childhood, my sister loved it, and therefore, so I never liked it. I dropped land, and he's doing this and that, and I don't really even remember how it goes. It's just like an abysmal version of Chutes and Ladders, which I always liked. So I remember that while he was stuck there, I made it all the way, and I mean, it was just a sure thing. I was going to win. And then I drew whatever card, and it sent me back down to, I don't know, I think Dante described it as one of his levels in the game. And there we go again. And so we kept playing. It was no problem. I was going to muscle through. And I made it back to that exact same spot. And I drew the same card that sent me to, now the same level. It took the third time before I realized there were two of us playing in a deck of cards that had an even number, and we were just doing the same moves over and over and over again, and would continue in perpetuity, and I would continue to make that one spot and so forth. And so I did what every loving father would do. I rearranged the cards so that one of us would win. My competitive nature may or may not have gotten the best of me, and I made sure one of us won, and, stick it, kid. And so finally ended, the game and won the game there, and he was none the wiser until I finally admitted it years later. I didn't really look forward to playing Candyland when the time came. It was, I've shared with y'all before my deep dislike of the ride. It's a small world in Disney World. I just don't care for it. And so it's not one of those things that I look forward to. There are some things that you just can't wait to do. I mean, with the baseball trip, we had been salivating over that for months. From the time that we had picked out our tickets, we loved doing them. There are other tasks that do not fall into that category. They seem pointless and meaningless. You have to do them, but they're a drudgery. You don't really necessarily like them so much. I grew up in Pleasant Grove, and over on my side of town, we did not play soccer. Soccer, we were fairly convinced was a communist plot that was ball and couldn't play it. He signed up to play soccer. I knew it was just a hoax. He was doing this as a trick against me, especially because the boy had no idea how to play soccer. He literally signed up to play soccer, came home and Googled, how do you play soccer? He bought the FIFA Xbox game so he could play on the Xbox game to figure out the rules of soccer. And I went, and it was just as miserable as I had expected it would be. They would taunt you. If you've been to a soccer game, you know what I'm talking about. It is a series of, oh, he almost scored. Endlessly, minute after minute, oh, that one was close. And finally, they would end the game. 1-0. 1-0. That's right, yeah. The boy from the other side of the railroad tracks can be taught. It was just, oh. And so I love my son, and so I've debated Candyland versus a soccer game. But I would go and watch this. That's probably not really accurate. The Bible has its gooey gumdrop areas where you venture in and you seem like you get stuck and you say, I'm never getting out of this place. How much longer can they go on talking about the word begat? Was it just easy to spell in Hebrew or something, and so they used it so much? But in fact, I know that I've used the Bible vindictively, in certain contexts for this purpose. When I would teach high school, I don't really have to deal with this very much in college, but teaching a bunch of high school freshman boys, they've got 150% of the energy that they need and need someplace to channel it, and usually that would be like clicking their binders open or clicking their pens or throwing something in the air or whatever they weren't supposed to be doing. And so my method for handling it, I came up with the 10 rules for thy beloved teacher's classroom. And so I would have the rules, and they would have to learn that thou shalt not throw an item in thy beloved teacher's class, neither toward the trash can, nor unto thy neighbor, nor even unto thyself. Those kinds of things. Thou shalt not arrive at thy beloved teacher's classroom without an epistle explaining thine untimely arrival. You got to bring a note if you're late to class. That was basically what that meant. You should have seen their eyes cross when they would hear the thine. And so if they violated one of my rules, and of course the last one was thou shalt not annoy thy beloved professor, because that was a great catch-all for all of the things that were common to their behavior. If they did something, I put their name on the board. It was a strike. And if they did something again, it was a second strike. And if they did it again, 3 strikes, and they got a writing assignment. And I would invariably give them the writing assignment from the first 11 chapters of 1 Chronicles. Now, I realize it probably would have been more edifying and gospel-centered for them to read like John 3 or something, but I did not want them to be able to look at a verse and say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and then write, for God so loved the world, he gave his Son. No, 1 Chronicles 1 through 11 is one endless genealogy. And so they would have to look literally word after word. And Avinoav became the father of Gabiltacrab or whatever and something, and they'd have to write just one word at a time. It was magnificent. I sent them there because I knew this was not exactly the mountaintop of scriptural literature. This is a kind of section it tends to slow down, and you bog down, and you wonder, Lord, I just know there's a reason why. But I don't know what that reason is, because it's not the best part of Scripture. The section that we're dealing with today probably falls into that category. It's the description of the tabernacle. The Bible is such an interesting book in general that I feel like if you're bored with it, you're just doing it wrong. You read these stories, and Samson rips a lion in half, and Avshalom, when he's ready to be king, he puts a tent on top of the palace, marches his father's harem into the tent right there in front of God and everybody. David sees Bathsheba, and you get this story of intrigue and adultery and murder. And so, many of these stories are things that you wouldn't even want your kids to read. In fact, when you see Veggie Tales, you'll notice the way they kind of sanitize some of those things. It's not David with Bathsheba, it's King George and the ducky that he covets. Or when the story of Esther, the guys don't actually get hung on their own, gallows there. They get sent off to the island of perpetual tickling. A little bit nicer, than what happens in some of the biblical stories. This is PG-13 or R-rated, many of these. They're interesting, they're fascinating. The tabernacle doesn't really fit that category. For a book that can be so brief in many respects, to suddenly spend around 15 chapters describing the construction of a tent seems like a lot. To just go on endlessly about, and thou shalt make the, rind covering of this and this fashion and so forth. And after they've described it for about 7 chapters, we get this little interlude with the golden calf, and then they go back and they talk about how they built the thing that they described that they were supposed to build. And you're thinking to yourself, if you're reading it properly, Lord, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Please, I know there's an end to this book. Everything's going to be okay. Just get me through the tabernacle and I'll be fine. And that's when you turn the page and you're in Leviticus. There has to be a reason for the Bible to spend so much time talking about this tent. It can't just be that there was extra parchment lying around somewhere and they had to fill it up. I don't believe that God had assigned Moses, like write a 1,000-word essay on such and such because you were bad in the wilderness or something. Of what the tabernacle was, what it looked like, how it was kind of set up and structured and so forth. And then once we've done that briefly, mercifully briefly, then we'll talk some about what the point of the tabernacle was, and I think that will be more important for us. So you've got your handout, so if you'll take a look there, the tabernacle is shockingly small. And I think it may actually be one of those indications about, again, the number of people in the Exodus is likely a smaller group of people than we're thinking. If we're using that high number of 5 million people, it's hard to imagine them doing all of their stuff in a complex that's about the size of this room. So that would be a lot of people for a very small shrine. In fact, the actual shrine itself is even smaller than that. The way the tabernacle is set up is the first thing that you would see if you were outside of the tabernacle is you would just see a curtain. And this curtain, it's about 7.5 feet tall, so only about to here. 7.5 feet tall, it's 75 feet one way and 150 feet the other way. In other words, you could fit, I think it's 4 of these on a football field. So one football field would hold not just the tent itself, the tabernacle proper, you could fit dozens of those, but the actual interior, and they overlap just a little bit, but there's an element of how when the wind would blow, you can kind of see through the cracks of the curtains that there. And that's a feature that's going to come up again and again and again in the description of the things in the tabernacle. So you got the outer court, and you enter that outer court. You can see right here, you'll notice that over on the right side of the page, it says entrance. That's the door to the entrance of the tent of meeting. So if you ever, like there's a scene in the Bible where the man with the worst timing in all of Scripture, there's a moment when the Israelites, they're participating in a very bizarre ritual that involves, worshiping the god Baal and also having sex with Moabite women. It's called sacred marriage. It's actually really common in the ancient world, is that the way that you channel fertility from the gods is we know the gods provide fertility. We know fertility comes from sex. And so they would go to the temple, hire temple prostitutes, and that was the way they thought they got fertility to come to them. Well, this is, of course, forbidden in the Bible. And so this is happening here at a place called Peor, and God starts smiting the people with a plague. And just at the moment when God tells Moses, kill the people who are doing this, here comes a guy walking right past the tent of meeting with the little trollop that he's got, and that's the one that Phineas, you may remember, he goes in and takes a spear and kills both of them at one time. It's at the entrance of the tent of meeting that this happens. Well, that's the entrance right there that we're talking about. So if you step into the courtyard, you have crossed one boundary. You have moved from what you would think of as profane space outside of the tabernacle into a more sacred space inside. Now, you're not in the most sacred space yet, but you're in a more sacred space, and you would see 2 things. Actually, I guess you'd probably see more than that. But the 2 structures that you would see is the first thing, you'd see the altar for burnt offering. Now, this is an altar that's 7.5 feet across and 7.5 feet this way. So it's a square that way, and it's about 4.5 feet tall. And it's actually just a box that they would fill with stones and dirt and earth and so forth. One of the rules about the altars that you make is that they were not allowed to be made of cut stones. They had to be made of natural stones. In fact, you can go to Beersheba, and there's this beautifully cut stone altar, and you know that it's illicit. It shouldn't have been made that way. It's a non-kosher altar, and it wasn't in the right place either. It shouldn't have been at Beersheba. It should have been at Jerusalem. So you can tell they're kind of on the fringes right there. When you see this altar for burnt offering, when they would sacrifice the animals, well, that's where they would burn them. And so they would send the smoke of the animal up to God right there. You go just a little further to the left, and that's the laver. And the laver is just a big bowl, basically, that has water, and that's where they would get the water for the ritual washings and things like that. More for the animals than for the people that they're doing, because, they wash the animal before they do stuff to it. So this is what we would see. Now, what else do we see? Well, we see people doing sacrifices. Actually, if you did a sacrifice, let's say you wanted to have meat for supper. In certain parts of the Bible, every animal that you had for meat, you had to offer as a sacrifice. At different points in time, they'll do it a different way. But you would come into the altar, you would sacrifice you would kill your own animal, you would dress the animal. Part of it would go to the priest. Part of it would go on top of the altar for burnt offering, and then the rest of it you got to keep. And so that's sort of the way that would work. There are other offerings that the priest would do, so like the purification offering. And so they would do that, and that's if you had a ritual impurity that was supposed to be removed there. So that's what's going on in this outer courtyard. There's something interesting about the items that are in that courtyard. For one thing, they're not as sacred as the next level. They're not made out of gold, they're made out of bronze, for example. And the colors in there, it's not the blue that is the most valuable of the fabrics, it's purple. And so you can tell that there's a kind of what you call a liminal area, that you've gone from the profane outside to a somewhat more sacred inside, and then we're about to enter into the most sacred, which is the tent itself. Isn't it interesting that that same kind of idea is present even in our own church architecture? That, outside on the street would be technically the profane area. That, it's not a negative term. It just means the common area. There are some things you wouldn't do in that lobby right there or the lobby of the sanctuary over there that you would do if you were out on the street. But then there's a whole nother area, which is the sanctuary itself, that you wouldn't do things even that you might do if you were in the lobby. So, for example, you might walk your dog along the sidewalk here. I would be hard-pressed to believe that you would bring your dog into the lobby of the sanctuary over there. You might have a cup of coffee, though, with you in the sanctuary over there. Not the sanctuary, in the lobby. I cannot bring myself to bring a cup of coffee into the sanctuary itself. It just feels like this is a sacred space and I shouldn't do that. You notice that we're in a liminal space right here. There are things we would do in this room that we wouldn't do in the sanctuary over there. We have these sort of gradations of sanctity. Same thing with the tabernacle. And so we've entered the outer courtyard. Now we're going to enter into the tabernacle proper. The entire tabernacle, the whole tent, is 45 feet by 15. If I walk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's it. And then 15 steps that way. And so 15 steps that way by 5 steps this way is the entire tabernacle. So the majority of this whole complex is just open courtyard. The tent itself is shockingly small. It's divided into 2 rooms, and so those 2 rooms, the first one that we would enter into, I use that term entirely, fallaciously here, because we are not entering into this room at all. The only people who could enter into this room were the priests. So as a regular Israelite, you could come into the courtyard. You could not enter into either of the 2 rooms that were there in the tabernacle proper. Only the priests could do that. And so that first room that we enter is what we call the holy place. Of our 45-foot by 15-foot room, it occupies the first 30 feet of the room. And when you enter that room, you can actually see there, it's called the shrine on your handout that you have there. It's got 3 pieces of furniture in there. So you step in, and over on the right, there's a table, and that's where they put the bread of presence. Every week they would bake unleavened bread, and they would put it there, and it would go right there. You remember the story? It comes up both in 1 Samuel and also in the book of Mark, where David is on the run from Saul, and his men are starving, and he says, to the priest at a place called Nov there, if you got any food? Oh, I'm sorry, David, we don't have any. Well, what about the showbread from the temple? Well, yeah, we've got that, but you can't eat it. You're not a priest. Give it to me. It'll be okay. And so David and his men eat the bread from the tabernacle that's there. And then Jesus actually quotes that story with approval. And so it must have been an enormous kind of structure. This menorah that's there, the 7 branches that are on it. You've probably seen 2 different kinds of menorahs before. One kind has 7 branches, and that's a regular menorah. The one you've probably seen more often has 9 branches, and that's the one for Hanukkah, because there are 8 branches that are for the candles for the 8 days of Hanukkah, and then there's one extra candle that's the servant candle that you use to light all of the others. So when you look at a menorah, you can count the branches and tell which one you're dealing with. Right in front of that other room is a small altar called the altar for incense. And so priests, not just people, they would take coals from the altar for burnt offering, and they would come and bring them and set them on top of that altar right there. There's no actual fire, it's just the hot coals. And then they would sprinkle aromatics on top of that, and it would give off this, smoke and aroma and so forth of incense. So we've stepped into the holy place, and that's the only thing that's there. No one but priests gets to go in there. And then we have the last room, and you all know this one. Now, Milgram calls it the Aditum, but we know it as the Holy of Holies. That is the Hebrew way of saying the most holy place. Hebrew doesn't have the and est endings that we have for the comparative and the superlative. So the way that they say the best of something is they say the something of something, Lord of lords, King of kings, Holy of holies. What it means is the highest Lord, the highest King, the holiest place. No one enters the Holy of Holies except the high priest, and then only once a year. This is the place that it has nothing inside it except for the Ark of the Covenant, and no one enters this place 364 days of the year. That's about right because they're on a lunar calendar. But so only the high priest enters this room, and only one time a year does he do so. Notice how we have passed from one liminal boundary to the next, to the next, to the next. When we stepped into the tabernacle proper, the tabernacle courtyard, we went from profane to one level of sanctity. When we moved into the holy place, it was an entirely different kind of level of sanctity. Only the priest, gold-covered appurtenances that are in there. And then finally, there's that most sacred place of all, the most holy place. Only the high priest, only once a year, with the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. If you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, interestingly, the version of the Ark of the Covenant that they have there actually looks very much like what the Bible describes. So if you want to know what it looks like, they did a pretty good job with it. The angels that they have touching are a little bit too human-like. The form of angels that they had back in the biblical period, they thought of them a little bit differently. But other than that, it actually looks quite good. And of course, if you went in there, it would melt your face off if you've seen Raiders. Okay. I digress, which is a habit of mine. So those are our items that make up the tabernacle. So we've got all of this description of all of these things, and it's all great and so forth. And the question then becomes, okay, why? Why do we have all of this? What is the point? In fact, the fact that we have so much description is something that leaps off the page in the Bible. If you think about a curious oddity in the way the Israelites wrote, they never describe what people look like. You ever notice this in the Bible? That the Bible almost never describes the physical features of a person. I mean, think back through some of the stories that you know. Sarah is apparently so drop-dead gorgeous that Abraham knows as they go down to Egypt, they are going to kill me to get you. You're that beautiful. And what does it say about her ravishing good looks, her extravagant figure and her beautiful hair and her great eyes and her face? Nary a word. It just says she is pretty to look at. Yafa mirot in Hebrew. Literally, the whole description, pretty to look at. Joseph is so handsome that Mrs. Potiphar cannot keep her paws off of him. And the sum total of the description of him is handsome to look at. We don't know anything about his broad shoulders or his physique or the six-pack abs or his muscle. Nary a word. Have you ever thought about Samson? You know, Samson, we know one thing about him: long hair. We don't know anything about the rest of him. In fact, there's a very interesting Rembrandt painting of Samson where Samson just looks like a sort of paunchy middle-aged man. And my students, when they would see that, would go, "That's not what Samson looks like. He's got the muscles and so forth." Find me in the Bible where it says such a thing. In fact, it doesn't say that he gets his strength from his muscles. It says he gets them from his hair. Maybe Rembrandt's onto something there. There's hope for all of us. Well, maybe not. So, some of us are in real trouble, you know. It's, you know, head you lose, you know, tails you lose again. As you know, you read it one place in a letter, and it'll say, you know, and if you could have, you would have been willing to give your own eyes to me. Or another place, see with what large letters I'm writing. Or he talks about the thorn in his side. And as people have put that together, they said, you know, I think Paul may have had an eye issue. And that's the sum total of everything that we can describe about what Paul looked like. The Messiah himself, we have no idea what Jesus looked like. There's not a word in Scripture. I mean, we know that he had this robe, you know, that was a seamless garment. That's really all that we know. The Bible just does not describe what people look like. Well, except on rare occasions. And when the Bible describes what someone looks like, pay attention, because it is going to be important in the story. Think, for example, of a character like, say, Saul. Remember how Saul is described as being handsome and head and shoulders taller than his countrymen. Well, why is that going to be important? Because the enemy that Saul will face will be the Philistines, led by their champion, Goliath. Saul is the king who's tall enough to go out and square off with Goliath, and that only throws into relief the fact that when Goliath is out there taunting everyone, he's back in the tent. And it will take a more diminutive David to go out there and actually face him. Or think about Absalom. Don't call him Absalom. Think about Absalom. It says that Absalom, God bless him, he was terribly vain. He only cut his hair once a year. And so he had these long, luxurious locks that would, you know, flow from his head. And you could tell how vain he was because when he cut his hair, he would weigh his hair to see how much it weighed and so forth. I've tried that, but the marvels of science have not really come up with scales that are quite that finely tuned to be able to. And his hair gets caught in the branches of an oak tree. And the donkey keeps going. Now, it's one of my favorite descriptions in the entire Bible. It says, and there he was, suspended between heaven and earth. How big was the donkey? I mean, you know, a donkey, you ride it, it's like this tall. Absalom's legs are maybe this far off of the ground. They're suspended between heaven and earth, you know. It's little Russell and up, you know, he leaps the Grand Canyon. You know, it's this. Well, there Absalom had long hair, or Saul was head and shoulders taller than his countrymen. You can take it to the bank. It's going to be important later in the story. When the Bible spends all of this time describing the tabernacle, you can tell for the Israelites this was a key place, a key moment, a key item and fixture in the center of their religious life. If it's that important, what is it important for? All right, let me give you 3 ideas about what I think the tabernacle is and how it functions in the life of Israel. First of all, the tabernacle is a throne room. The tabernacle is a throne room. It's the room for a king. In the ancient Near East, they often placed the temples and the palaces next to one another, and they both were marked by these signs of royalty. For example, the blues and the purples in the cloth. It's the same kind of cloth that you would have if you were a king back in the ancient world. The blue dye that they used to color the robes blue is actually made from the shell of a snail. It's called a murex snail. It takes 1,000 snails, 1,000 of these murex snails to get a thimbleful of blue dye. In one statistic that I read, and this has been 2 decades ago, so I know it's out of date, but at the time they estimated that just the high priest robes would have cost $96,000. And this was, with inflation and so forth, who knows what that means today. But it was an extravagantly expensive sort of thing. And even the kind of setup of it sort of fits with the way a throne room works. Before you get to the throne room, there's the antechamber. There's the waiting room that you go into first. So that you first enter into that antechamber, and only then do you get to enter into the presence of the sovereign. And we've seen these in the ancient world. For example, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, had an enormous antechamber before his actual throne room. He decorated it with these stone posters called bas-reliefs of the various victories that he had won. So that when you wanted to go to Sennacherib and protest because you thought your taxes were too high, you're walking around, and instead of looking at the magazines in the doctor's office, you're looking at all of the victims of his armies who were being impaled here or killed there, and you're reconsidering whether taxes are really such a bad thing. And personally, I think they're great for civic understanding and mutual submission. I'm good, King. I just wanted to say hey, and you're racist. This is that antechamber that you cooled your heels in before you went in and visited the actual king. The tabernacle is set up this way. There's the palace where the courtyard begins, and then you enter into the antechamber, and then the throne room is the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. What's interesting about that is that the top of the Ark of the Covenant, it's called the kaporet, is actually described as the divine footstool. It's not the divine throne. It's only the footstool for the throne, which I guess theoretically is in heaven. It says something about this. This isn't God's actual throne room. It's only a sort of model, a shadow, an echo of the actual divine throne room where God really resides up in heaven. So why is it important that this is a throne room? Well, first of all, it's because it reminds us that God is king. One of the things that the setup of the tabernacle is intended to convey is that God is a sovereign and has to be approached as that kind of sovereign. And when I say sovereign, we're not talking about the current, king and queen of the Netherlands who, they live in a regular house and go biking through the countryside. We're not even talking about someone like Queen Elizabeth. We're talking about one of those old school kind of sovereigns, the one whose word is law, who is just an utter potentate. Think of the way the Israelites thought of kingship, where people lived and died at the command of the king. This is the kind of sovereign that God is being described as. He is a king. There's a subtle element to this that I frankly just find fascinating. A friend of mine presented a paper at the Society of Biblical Literature a couple years ago, and he noticed that the colors of the curtains in the tabernacle and the colors of the priestly vestments are the same. And he said, why is this? And his conclusion was, and I think he's absolutely right, it is priestly camouflage. The priests are attendants upon the king, and they are meant to be off in the corners where they are not disturbing the royal presence. One of the oddities about the tabernacle is there's no indication that the priests do any speaking inside the tabernacle. In fact, Israel Knoll has written a book called The Sanctuary of Silence. It was apparently entirely silent in there. The priests are wearing garments that blend in with the curtains. It appears that they were barefoot, so they're not making noise as they walk. The only kind of blemish, physical blemish, that you could have as a priest and still be allowed to serve was you could be missing a tooth. And he said, well, gosh, that's just such a garish kind of blemish. Not if your mouth is closed. And the priests, apparently, they worked silently with their mouths closed and so forth. You know who they are? They're the staff that waits on the Granthams in Downton Abbey. You know how, I remember a scene where there's a new server who is there, and he says something to the family while they're eating, and Carson, has to stifle 8 heart attacks and a stroke as he gives a, sort of cough to him. We do not speak to the family here. The Granthams, they're low-level peerage here. This is describing priests as people who are supposed to be sort of off in the wings, not disturbing the royal presence who's there. God is being depicted as a king. One of the purposes of the tabernacle is to reinforce this notion that when one approaches God, one is approaching the Lord of all that is. One is approaching a sovereign. Second idea, the tabernacle is a throne room. Secondly, the tabernacle is a world. The tabernacle is a world. The tabernacle is a unique creation. If you read through the descriptions of all of the appurtenances that they create for the tabernacle, the number 7 comes up again and again. One of the reasons for this is because there is this long-standing tradition in the ancient Near East that tabernacles and creation take place in series of 7s. I mean, think about Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is describing the creation of the world, and it puts it in this 7-day structure. It's also describing the construction of a temple. The earth in Genesis 1 is being described as the temple. The universe is the temple that God inhabits. What temple, you notice how the scripture repeatedly says, the Lord does not live in a house made by human hands. No, he resides as his temple in the universe, which he made with his own hands. And it's interesting if you look at some of these other ancient Near Eastern texts that what they do is once they've created the temple, then they take their image and they stick it into the temple. How does God make us? In the image of God. So he makes the universe and then sticks his image, us, into the temple / creation. The tabernacle is a new creation. It's completed on the first day of the first month. It's the same day that actually, in the terrarium. I don't know if any of you have ever seen one of those, but, it's one of those things where you have such power over it, you can arrange so that this plant goes here and this goes here and here's where the stones go and so forth. You make this little miniature world the way that you want to. My students would be more into something like Sim City, where on a computer you can create this simulation of something. Maybe some of y'all are more of the age where we had train tables and such when we were kids, and you could make this little world the way that it was supposed to be. The tabernacle is meant to be a world that operates the way at least the priests in Israel thought the world ought to act. It's a place where appropriate close to God, through the altar. We have the closeness of being able to join in that meal with God, but then there are also appropriate boundaries where we only get so close, but we also have to respect where those lines are that are in there. I don't have nearly enough time to share this story, but it's irresistible. The president of the seminary that I attended was in Malaysia one time, and they were there on the beach with his family. He's wearing nothing but his, swimsuit because they've been out, swimming and so forth. And the Queen of England visited Malaysia. And when she got out at a certain place, she's got the guards and so forth there. And I don't know why she was there. But because it was the Queen of England, there was just a press of people sort of gathered around. And our seminary president ended up getting pushed up against Queen Elizabeth II in his bathing suit. and his description of this was, I was with her, but I wasn't really with her. I was in her presence, but not really. This was not the audience with the queen that one would want to have. This was one where it was just a melee, and the security situation had gotten out of hand there. Even when one approaches Queen Elizabeth, there is this elaborate protocol of boundaries. If you've seen, the movie The Queen, for example, you remember when Tony Blair, he gets instructed upon, first one enters and bows the head, and then one waits for her to extend her hand, and then you go over, and they call entering into her presence the presence. This is this idea that this is a place where there are appropriate boundaries. And yet those boundaries are only needed because this is where God is coming to visit humanity. Why is it important that the tabernacle functions as a world? It's because this is a place that accommodates the transcendence of God. Every other story in the ancient Near East is about pumping the gods up so that they can be bigger. The Bible has the opposite problem. The Bible's difficulty is figuring out how to get the God who spoke the universe into existence to be able to come down and interact with humanity. Psalm 113 says that God stoops down to behold the heavens and the earth. Isaiah 40, he measures the universe with a span, holds the waters of the oceans in the cup of his hand. He counts the nations as just dust on the scales that you wouldn't take the time to wipe off there. The difficulty of the Bible is figuring out how to get this great God down to a level where we can interact. The tabernacle is meant to be that way, that channel, that thing that allows God to come down and visit with humanity. The tabernacle is a throne room. The tabernacle is a world. Lastly, the tabernacle is a portable Mount Sinai. If you think about the features of Mount Sinai and the features of the tabernacle, they align remarkably. There are three areas. Remember at Mount Sinai, there was the foot of the mountain, the side of the mountain, and the top of the mountain. The people had to stay at the foot. The elders and Moses, they go up onto the side. Eventually Moses alone goes onto the top. This is the tabernacle. The people can go in the courtyard. Only the priest can go into the holy place. Only the high priest can go into the most holy place. There are cloud and smoke on Mount Sinai. The tabernacle is marked by a perpetual smoke from the sacrifices going up and the divine cloud that rests over the Holy of Holies. There is fire on Mount Sinai. There is the fire both of the altar for burnt offering and also the smoke that's coming up from the incense altar. At the center of the Sinai experience is the Ten Commandments. If you look at that text, chapters 19 and 24 are the bookends, and what's in the middle is giving the Ten Commandments. In the center of the tabernacle courtyard is the Ark of the most holy place. In the center of the most holy place is the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the Ark of the Covenant is the Ten Commandments. At the center of both of them is the Word. Just as God visits Sinai but doesn't live there, God visits the tabernacle but doesn't live there. But he does choose to visit there. He says, I will be with you. So why is it important that the tabernacle be a portable Mount Sinai? If you put it in one word, it's really quite simple. It's a souvenir. Think about, the word souvenir, to remember, is what the word means. When I visit places, I try to take something as a souvenir. If I'm in the Elah Valley, I take a rock, because this is the place where David fought Goliath. If I'm, we were out at Pebble Beach, I mentioned this last week, I told the boys, get a small pebble, because you'll remember this place. You'll remember this moment by that souvenir that you have. The purpose of the tabernacle is to be a reminder of that moment that the people experienced with God at Mount Sinai. It occurred to me that the actual event of the Exodus was experienced by remarkably few people. It has been remembered by countless millions and even billions since. In a very real sense, the Exodus belongs as much to us, perhaps more, than it belonged to the people who actually went through it. The people who went through it, most of them didn't even make it to the Promised Land. The Exodus becomes such a pivotal event for their children who do go into the Promised Land, and their grandchildren, and their spiritual great-great-great-grandchildren, all the way to the present day. We are the ones who hold on to the Exodus as a reminder of what God did in that moment of liberation. If I were to draw a conclusion from that way that the book of Exodus caps off and try to apply it to our present life, I would say that there's a principle in there that it is vital for us to find souvenirs of those moments when God is real to us. Because times will come when God does not feel as real to us. In those moments when we feel God's presence, when we see His intervention in our lives, when we know He's there and there's nothing that could dissuade us from that, those are the moments to take souvenirs. Those are the moments to find something that we can hold on to, whether it's a journal or a verse that we write down or something, but something to hold on to that moment, because dark times will come. And in those dark times, when God seems so absent, what is it that's going to sustain us and hold on to it? It's being able to think back to those moments when we knew God's presence was real, so that we won't doubt in the dark the things we knew were real when we saw them in the light. If you read the lament psalms in the Bible, this is certainly the way that they act. They constantly say to God, I will be able to keep up the why and the where are you. It's having that one hand holding on to that moment when we knew God was real that will help sustain us in those difficult moments that invariably come when we do have to say why and I don't understand. If the tabernacle is there for anything, it is there to say, don't you forget, we met. In fact, we didn't just meet, we're married. Remember that moment that happened. Tough times are going to come. We're going to go through the wilderness, and it's going to be hard. But remember that moment when we were together, and let that be the moment that sustains you. Let's pray. Father in heaven, Lord, I thank you so much for the book of Exodus. Lord, what a wonderful encapsulation of your outreach to humanity, your power to save, your grace to love. Lord, I pray that you'll help us to hold on to those tabernacle moments as we go through the more difficult moments of life. I pray all of this in Jesus' name.